What happens when a racist cop targets the wrong man, and the truth unravels in front of a crowd? Imagine this. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in Portland, Oregon, a day when families filled local parks, joggers lined the trails, and the aroma of food trucks wafted through the crisp air. Franklin Park, one of the city's busiest green spaces, buzzed with life but remained peaceful. Kids laughed on swings, friends shared stories over picnic blankets, and distant melodies from live music added charm to the scene. In the heart of this vibrant tapestry stood a man named Everett. Impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, polished shoes gleaming under the sunlight, he exuded calm confidence. Earlier, Everett had been seated at a cafe near the park, reviewing documents for his job as a civil investigator. But what began as a minor misunderstanding quickly spiraled into something far more significant. The cafe manager, agitated and defensive, argued loudly with Everett about an accidental double charge on his bill. Onlookers could feel the tension thickening in the air, though Everett's voice stayed measured. "I understand mistakes happen," he said, holding up his receipt like evidence in a courtroom. "But I've already paid once. I'm just asking for a correction." The manager's response cut through the atmosphere like a knife. "You people always think you can come in here and cause trouble." His words hung heavy, sharp, and laced with prejudice. Everett froze, the phrase "you people" striking him like a slap across the face. Before he could respond, the door chimed, and in walked Officer Grayson, dressed casually yet radiating authority. Grayson overheard fragments of the argument on his way in and immediately jumped to conclusions. Without uttering a single question, he stepped between the two men, demanding, "What's going on here?" His gaze locked squarely onto Everett, ignoring the context entirely. The cafe manager pointed angrily. "This guy's causing a scene over nothing. I want him out." Everett turned to Grayson, his expression calm but firm. "Officer, there's no scene. I was double charged, and I simply asked for it to be fixed. That's all." But Grayson wasn't listening. To him, Everett's sharp suit and composed demeanor didn't matter. He saw only a problem that needed swift resolution. "Step outside," Grayson ordered, his hand twitching near his baton. Everett's voice dropped low, steady, and resolute. "I've done nothing wrong, officer. I'm happy to talk, but there's no need for this." Grayson's reply came swift and chilling. "I said step outside." And before Everett could utter another word, the situation escalated beyond anyone's expectations. The cafe fell silent as Grayson's voice rang out, sharp and unyielding. A few patrons exchanged uneasy glances while others instinctively reached for their phones, sensing the storm brewing. Everett stood his ground, hands clearly visible, his composure unwavering. Yet, his calmness seemed only to fuel Grayson's agitation further. "Officer, I'm not resisting," Everett said, his tone calm but resolute. "There's no need for this aggression." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped, stepping closer, the baton now unhooked from his belt. The room brimmed with tension, the air thick with unspoken assumptions and fears. As Everett raised his hands slightly in a gesture of openness, Grayson misinterpreted it as defiance. Without warning, the baton struck hard, landing on Everett's shoulder. The crack of impact echoed through the cafe, followed by collective gasps from the crowd. "Stop!" a woman near the counter yelled, her voice trembling. "He didn't do anything." Everett stumbled but remained upright, clutching his arm. His eyes met Grayson's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The look on Everett's face wasn't anger, it was quiet disbelief, piercing and profound. "Officer, you're making a mistake," Everett said, his voice steady despite the pain. "You don't know who I am or why I'm here." Grayson's face flushed with adrenaline and frustration. "I don't care who you are," he barked. "You don't get to cause problems and act like a victim." At that moment, a young man near the back of the cafe, phone in hand, began recording. Others followed suit, their screens capturing every detail, the officer's aggression, Everett's restraint, and the murmurs of outrage growing louder with each passing second. "Someone call 911, a patron shouted, irony dripping from the plea. "This is police brutality." Grayson turned briefly, his gaze flickering toward the phones pointed at him. But his grip on control didn't loosen. Instead, he grabbed Everett by the arm and began dragging him toward the door. Everett didn't resist, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos around him. As they stepped outside, the scene spilled into the park. Families paused mid-play, joggers slowed to a halt, and a crowd began to gather. Everett's voice, though pained, carried clarity. "This isn't how justice works," he said, addressing not just Grayson but everyone watching. "This isn't right." The recording continued, capturing Grayson's growing unease as more voices joined in. "Let him go," someone shouted. Another chimed in, "You're out of line." Grayson's hand wavered on his baton, the weight of the crowd's judgment sinking in. But before he could respond, a voice from the back of the crowd cut through the commotion. "Hey, isn't that the civil rights investigator? I've seen him on the news." A murmur rippled through the onlookers as realization dawned. Everett wasn't just another cafe patron, he was Everett James, a prominent investigator for the state's Human Rights Commission, known for uncovering cases of systemic discrimination across the city. The man Grayson had struck wasn't a troublemaker, he was a watchdog for justice. Grayson's confidence faltered, his grip loosening slightly on Everett's arm. But the damage was done. Cameras were still rolling, and the crowd's outrage was now laser-focused on him. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. The fallout from this moment would unravel faster and cut deeper than anyone expected. By the time the police cruiser arrived, Grayson's composure had crumbled. The crowd outside the cafe had swelled, their voices louder and angrier. Everett, now seated on a park bench with ice pressed to his shoulder, remained remarkably composed. His quiet dignity contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. The arriving officers, alerted by frantic calls from witnesses, immediately realized something was off. One of them, Sergeant Paula Hensley, approached Everett cautiously. She had seen his face before, on local news segments and in public hearings, and the pieces of the puzzle quickly fell into place. "Mr. James," she asked, her tone softer than usual. "Are you all right?" Everett nodded, his calm eyes locking onto hers. "I'm fine," he said. "But this needs to be documented." Sergeant Hensley looked over at Grayson, who was visibly shaken, his hands fidgeting as he tried to explain himself to the other officers. He was being uncooperative, Grayson muttered, avoiding eye contact. But his words carried no weight against the sea of phone recordings and eyewitness accounts. Hensley turned back to Everett. "Would you like to press charges?" Everett's response was measured. "I'd like the truth to come out, Sergeant. I'm not here to punish. I'm here to reveal what's broken." What followed was a whirlwind of statements, reports, and phone footage reviewed at the precinct. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of Grayson's actions. But what truly shocked the department wasn't just the incident itself, it was Everett's reason for being at the cafe in the first place. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Everett had been working undercover for months, quietly collecting evidence of discriminatory practices in local businesses. The cafe, as it turned out, was one of several establishments flagged for biased treatment based on race or appearance. His role as a civil investigator wasn't just a job, it was a mission to expose the subtle yet pervasive inequities woven into daily life. The department's internal affairs team quickly took over, shifting focus from the cafe incident to a broader examination of Grayson's record. What they found was troubling: complaints of excessive force, biased language during stops, and a pattern of targeting minority communities had been quietly filed away over the years. Grayson's behavior that day wasn't an anomaly, it was the culmination of a long, unchecked history. News of the incident spread rapidly, with clips from the cafe going viral within hours. Social media exploded with outrage, hashtags calling for justice trending nationwide. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Everett's poised recounting of the event alongside the damning footage of Grayson's actions. Yet amidst the growing storm, Everett maintained his focus. He wasn't interested in sensationalism or vengeance. Instead, he used his platform to emphasize the systemic issues at play. "This isn't just about one officer," he said during an interview. "It's about a culture that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. Accountability starts with acknowledging the problem." Back at the precinct, Grayson sat in a dimly lit conference room, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions, and their consequences, was finally sinking in. He had thought his badge shielded him from scrutiny, but now he faced a tidal wave of accountability. Yet even as the evidence mounted and the public demanded justice, Everett wasn't done yet. His next move would challenge Grayson in ways he never expected. Instead, he chose to share his story, the struggles etched into his life, the discrimination that had shadowed him like a relentless storm, and the flicker of hope he still clung to for a brighter future. "Bias isn't always intentional," he began, his voice steady as a mountain stream. But when left unchecked, it becomes dangerous. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. We all have a role to play in creating a system that serves everyone fairly. The room fell silent, the weight of his truth pressing down on every listener. Even Grayson, seated near the back, couldn't deny the honesty in Everett's words. For the first time, he saw Everett not as an adversary but as a man fighting for something far greater than himself, a cause rooted in justice and humanity. Yet, while Everett's words planted seeds of change, the real turning point was yet to come. A confrontation loomed, one that would force Grayson to stare directly into the mirror of his own soul. Grayson sat stiffly in the dimly lit room of the Restorative Justice Center, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. Weeks had passed since the incident at the cafe, weeks filled with public shame, isolation, and sleepless nights haunted by regret. Now, here he was, face to face with the man he had wronged. Across from him, Everett sat calmly, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, piercing through the haze of tension. The facilitator, a middle-aged woman with a soothing voice, broke the silence. "This space is for open dialogue," she said, her gaze shifting between the two men. "No interruptions. No judgment." She paused, then turned to Grayson. "Officer Grayson, you may begin." Grayson's throat felt dry, his tongue thick and clumsy. He shifted uncomfortably, struggling to find the right words. He stopped, took a breath, and tried again. "I want to apologize for what I did. For how I acted. It was wrong." Everett didn't flinch. He simply waited, giving Grayson the space to continue. "I thought I knew what was happening that day," Grayson admitted, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his emotions. "I thought I was doing my job. But I see now that I wasn't listening. I didn't see you. I only saw what I assumed about you. And I'm ashamed of that." The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching like taut wire. Then Everett spoke, his tone measured but laced with quiet intensity. "Do you understand what that moment cost me, Officer Grayson? It wasn't just physical pain. It was the realization that no matter how hard I work, how I dress, or how I carry myself, someone like you could still see me as a threat." Grayson looked down, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. "I do now," he admitted softly. "And I hate that I was part of the problem." Everett leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step. But what matters is what you do next. What will you change, Officer Grayson? Not just for yourself, but for the people you serve?" Grayson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I don't know yet. But I'm willing to learn. I want to be better." The facilitator nodded, encouraging the dialogue to flow further. Everett softened slightly, his voice carrying a tone of quiet resolve. "Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. And it starts with accountability, understanding that actions have consequences. I'm not here to punish you, Grayson. I'm here because I believe people can grow." The session continued, delving deeper into the choices that led to that fateful moment at the cafe and the broader implications of systemic bias. By the end, Grayson was emotionally drained but also oddly hopeful. For the first time, he felt the weight of his responsibility, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to make amends. But the true test wouldn't happen within these walls, it would unfold in how Grayson carried these lessons into his life moving forward. In the weeks following the restorative justice session, Grayson began taking deliberate steps to address the damage he had caused, not just to Everett, but to the community he was sworn to protect. His first move was attending every workshop on implicit bias offered by the department, even the optional ones. At first, he felt like an outsider, surrounded by colleagues who now viewed him as the poster child for misconduct. But he stayed, listened intently, and took meticulous notes. His silence spoke louder than any defensive words ever could. Meanwhile, Everett continued his mission, using the platform the incident had given him to amplify the voices of those often ignored. He spoke at town halls and schools, sharing his story not to incite anger but to inspire change. His message was simple yet profound: justice isn't about revenge, it's about restoring balance. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Grayson approached Everett at a community event. This time, there was no uniform, no badge, just a man with an outstretched hand and an expression of humility. "I know it'll take time," Grayson said, his voice steady but quiet. "But I want to help however I can." Everett studied him for a moment before shaking his hand. Then start by listening, he replied. The rest will follow. Together, they began collaborating on a new initiative, a joint program between the police department and the Human Rights Commission. The goal was to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served, fostering mutual understanding through dialogue and training. It was an uphill battle, met with skepticism from all sides, but Everett and Grayson remained steadfast. For Grayson, the work became deeply personal. He began speaking at police academies, sharing his story as a cautionary tale for recruits. Your badge doesn't make you infallible, he would say. It makes you accountable. Over time, the program began to show results. Complaints of misconduct dropped, community trust improved, and officers started approaching their roles with greater empathy. It wasn't a perfect system, there were still setbacks and challenges, but the change was undeniable. As for Everett, his resolve only grew stronger. He remained a relentless advocate for justice but never lost sight of the humanity in his mission. We all make mistakes, he often said. What matters is whether we learn from them. But this wasn't just Everett's story, or Grayson's. It was a story about what happens when accountability meets courage, and when individuals choose to see each other not as adversaries but as people. Months turned into a year, and the city began to feel the ripple effects of their efforts. The program they had started didn't just change policies, it changed people. Officers who had once dismissed the idea of bias training began speaking openly about their experiences, acknowledging their blind spots, and taking steps to do better. Community members who had lost faith in the system started to see glimpses of hope. Everett's story, and the way he handled the injustice he faced, became a testament to the power of grace under pressure. His ability to channel pain into progress showed that real change often begins with one person refusing to give in to anger or despair. For Grayson, the journey was far from over. But he was no longer the man who walked into that cafe with assumptions and arrogance. He carried the weight of his mistakes, not as a burden but as a reminder to remain vigilant against the biases that once ruled his decisions. Though he could never undo the harm he had caused, he dedicated himself to ensuring it wouldn't happen again, not on his watch. As the story spread beyond Portland, it became a source of inspiration. It reminded people that accountability isn't about tearing each other down, it's about building something better together. The conversations Everett and Grayson started echoed across communities, sparking dialogues about justice, empathy, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. And so, the story leaves us with a question: what kind of change are we willing to fight for? Are we brave enough to look inward, to confront our own biases, and to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult? If this story resonated with you, share it. Talk about it. Think about how you can be part of the solution in your own community.